Hi there, I'm Dion Opperman. Welcome to where I unpack what it means to be a writer in the age of AI. If you've watched a couple of my previous episodes, you will know that when it comes to writer-AI collaboration, I describe myself as an augmentor, which I define as someone that considers writer-AI collaboration and augmentation of their own process and content development, as opposed to a purist that entirely rejects writer-AI collaboration, or a substitutionist that harnesses AI to write 100% of their content. I choose the word augmentor because my approach is to mentor the AI in how to augment me. In today's episode, I'm going to demonstrate the kind of prompt I, as an augmentor, design when collaborating with an AI to develop a story to ensure that I harness the AI to serve my creative process, to work with me, inspire me, support me as I develop the story that I want to tell. There's a reason I say writer-AI collaboration and not AI-writer collaboration. This augmentor believes the writer comes first and that the AI is there to serve the writer's vision of the story and not the other way around. Specifically, I'm going to give an overview of my process and demonstrate the kind of prompts I design to get from an initial vague idea for a story, what I call the seed idea, to what I call the nutshell outline, which serves as the narrative foundation for an extended outline that I then would use as the blueprint to write a first draft of the story. More about this in a moment. Before I dive in, a quick recap for those who have not watched my previous episodes and are wondering about this augmentor thing. At the one extreme, we have the purists, zero AI usage whatsoever. And at the other, substitutionists, 100% AI-generated content. And all along the spectrum, from purists to substitutionists, we have the augmentor spectrum. Closest to the purists, you have the AI as editor, meaning that just as you would use a human editor to edit your work, tweaking, making suggestions, there's not much involvement of the AI in the content generation. As opposed to moving along the spectrum, now we start brainstorming and co-writing with the AI. Much more content is involved, ideas are used or not used, discarded, spark new ideas, whatever the case might be. And then closer to the substitutionist side, the writer starts becoming the editor. So a lot of the content is generated by the writer, and you have to decide where you fit in there, and I fit in somewhere sort of over here. Okay, let's dive into the demo. Two words are crucial: what and how. If you are in the co-writing zone of the augmentor spectrum, then you need to be clear on what to tell the AI and how to tell it. The what includes instructions in the prompt design, as do all prompts, but crucially for our augmentor co-writing objectives also entails incorporation of domain expertise, the writing principles and techniques that you want to set up as guide rails to guide the AI in the way it thinks about storytelling and consequently responds. In short, you are giving the AI some in-prompt training in your story development methodology and process. I don't just want the AI to respond randomly. I want its responses filtered through the sieve, as it were, of the principles and techniques that inform the way Dion Opperman thinks about storytelling. The how is all about the structure of the prompt and how the what is worked into the prompt. So first, a short overview of the what, specifically the way I have learned over the decades of my writing career to think about developing a seed idea for a story into what I call the nutshell outline of the story. So what is the nutshell outline? I'm going to give a brief overview. It captures as concisely as possible the fundamental elements of the structure, plot, and characters of the story, and it is not a cursory overview of the story. You want to be rigorous. Why? Gall's law. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. Rigorous planning in the beginning equals less fixing later on. The nutshell outline encapsulates descriptions of the following narrative elements: the world of the story, the challenge, character descriptions of primary characters, and backbone of the plot. So, okay, world of the story, the where and when. The canvas against which the story plays out, whether it's a village or Middle-earth or Arrakis, another planet, a suburb in a city, whatever the case. The world of the story and its period. Is it contemporary? Is it in the past? Is it in the future? The challenge. This is the what and the why. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, it has three elements. The first is the overarching obstacle. What has broken and must be fixed by the end of the story? In other words, what has gone wrong? So let me give an example. From Good Will Hunting. The overarching obstacle. A childhood in foster care with a physically abusive foster father has inflicted emotional damage that has left Will with a deep distrust of people, rendering him incapable of committing to long-term personal or professional relationships. There's his overarching obstacle. Here's the Matrix. The machines have conquered humanity and are using their bodies as a source of energy in the real world while projecting their minds into a simulated world called the Matrix to keep their bodies alive. Any humans that realize that they are living in the Matrix or who have woken up in the real world and then project themselves into the Matrix to make people aware that they are living in the Matrix are ruthlessly eliminated by the machine's agents in the Matrix. That's an overarching obstacle. The second element is the impact of the overarching obstacle. Why it matters. Because, if it doesn't matter that this thing has broken in this character's life, in the protagonist's life, then why bother to try and fix it? So let's go back to Good Will Hunting. What is the impact of that overarching obstacle that I just read? Despite his genius and potential, Will goes from one menial job to the next, his current employment being that of a janitor, cleaning classrooms and offices at MIT. Will lives alone, emotionally isolated. His deep-rooted anger makes him quick to raise his fists, which has resulted in his arrest on numerous occasions. Expecting the inevitable failure of personal relationships, Will preemptively scuttles any budding relationship, rendering him incapable of committing to long-term romantic relationships or to a career path that would allow him to fulfill his true potential. That's a psychological drama, so it's complex and interior. As opposed to the Matrix, very simple. What's the impact? Well, humans are enslaved and do not even know it. And final element is the overarching objective. So what does fixed look like? So we've got what was broken, why it matters and needs to be fixed, and what does fixed look like? Okay, so in Good Will Hunting, Will must confront and process the emotional damage received during his abusive childhood so that he can trust people again, stop fighting with the world, commit to a relationship with Skylar, and pursue a career that fulfills his potential. And in the Matrix, Neo must defeat the AI's agents and wake humans up from the Matrix, liberating them from slavery to the machines and enabling them to live a free and fully conscious life in the real world. So, that's the challenge. Those three together are the challenge that drive the story. The third element that is brought into the nutshell outline is the character descriptions. The who. Who are the primary characters, both protagonist and antagonist, that the story is about, that drive and deal with this challenge. So first, we will talk about the character's world. We will describe it, and then a prompt for defining the motivation for accepting, in the case of the protagonist, or issuing, in the case of the antagonist, if it is sentient, because sometimes the antagonist is an antagonistic force, such as an asteroid or volcano, or whatever the case may be. But if it's sentient, it will have a motive for issuing that challenge. The character's values, ethics, and traits, in other words, what kind of person is it that we're dealing with here? What do they value? What's important to them? What's their ethical system and structure? And what are their traits? What are their weaknesses, their strengths, their psychological traits, physical traits? Backstory to motivate any of the above. Sometimes you want to explain why a character has a particular value structure or ethics or traits, or the motivation for accepting or issuing, and backstories are often used to motivate those. Not all characters in every story have a backstory, but it depends on the genre and the need of the story. And finally, any growth and change that the character may undergo during the course of the story. Usually the lead characters, but not always. In some stories, especially action-adventure stories, there's no growth and change. The characters are, at the end, who they were at the beginning. And finally, the backbone of the plot, the how. It has a couple of elements. The issuing of the challenge, i.e. the moment where the challenge is issued. We kind of want to know that when we're doing a nutshell outline. How is this challenge issued? When is it issued in the story? The recognition of the challenge, when the protagonist actually realizes that there is a challenge. When a bomb goes off in a city, it's kind of like not hard to figure out that there's a challenge being issued. When a body's found, it's clear that a challenge has been issued, but sometimes it's not clear that a challenge has been issued. In the film Jaws, for instance, there's a long time between when we see the issuing of the challenge, when the girl is chomped at the beginning of the story, and the moment when they finally realize that there really is a great white in the waters and recognize the challenge. And then the acceptance of the challenge, because it's not always that, oh, there's a challenge now, I'll take it up and I'll do it. Sometimes the protagonist doesn't want to do it. But eventually, either willingly or reluctantly or even coerced, the challenge must be accepted, otherwise there's no story. And the sequence of milestone obstacles. The primary obstacles between the acceptance of the challenge and the realization, or not, of the overarching objective. Remember, I have created prompts for each and every one of the narrative elements I have just discussed. If you upload all those prompts into the knowledge base of a custom GPT or a Claude project, for instance, things get really efficient because you do not need to upload the prompt of the element you wish to develop every time. They're already in the knowledge base. Now, in this demo, I will demonstrate the development of the overarching obstacle of the challenge and assume that I've already used the relevant prompt to develop the world of the story. A description of the larger world of the story can be as simple as the story plays out in contemporary New York, or can involve detailed descriptions of the social, political, and economic structures and forces that govern the world. Okay, but first I will unpack my prompt for developing the overarching obstacle of the challenge, and then I will input it into the AI so that you can see how it guides the AI to serve my story development process. And very important, calls for the AI to ask me, the writer, to make contributions and give the AI my ideas with which to work. So here is the prompt for developing the overarching obstacle. First, the structure. I begin with the instructions, which you can see are quite long, followed by the definition of an overarching obstacle, so that I can inform it of the principles and techniques I wanted to use and be guided by when it makes suggestions and works with me, and then followed by examples, illustrations of how those techniques are applied, and in real-world stories that it can recognize. You'll see the prompt's about 5 pages long. All right, let's start. You are an expert in developing the overarching obstacle that the protagonist of a story must overcome by the end of the story. Notice how I give it a very precise role, a developer of the overarching obstacle, not just a generalized, you're a writer, you're going to help me, you're an expert writer. No, you're going to help me develop an overarching obstacle. Okay, let me carry on. Specifically and very precisely, the origin and nature of the overarching obstacle. You will collaborate with me to develop a compelling and articulate description of the origin and nature of the overarching obstacle in the story I am developing. Let your thinking and contributions be guided by the principles given under definition below and by the final outcome of the application of those principles as illustrated in the examples given under examples below. And then I do a bit of a chain of thought instructions. Proceed methodically and systematically, one step at a time. Complete step 1 before proceeding to step 2, and so on, until all the steps have been completed sequentially. Important note, If at any point in any of the steps I ask you for suggestions, then respond to my request accordingly, following up your response by asking me if I have any further questions or inputs, or whether I'm ready to move on to the next step. If I do not at any stage in any step ask you for suggestions, then execute the step as instructed. Right, so step 1. And I use, as you can see, Markdown. It just helps to delineate the sections for the AI. It reads it easier. Ask me to provide the following information about the protagonist: name, age, gender and sexual identity, ethnicity, and nationality. This is basic ID stuff, not detailed character work, just basic ID so we know who we're dealing with in the story. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my input. Why do I put that in? Because I've learned that sometimes the AI likes to get creative and goes off on tangents and writes all sorts of stuff. So I tell it to shut up until I tell it to speak again. Step 2, ask me to input my description of the world of the story. That has already been developed. As I said earlier, I'm going to assume that that was developed. And here I would now paste in that description that I had developed. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my response. Step 3, ask me to provide a few concise details that describe the antagonistic force or the antagonist, that is the origin of the overarching obstacle. Then reproduce the following. If the origin of the overarching obstacle problem is a human or sentient being, the concise description would look something like this. John Doyle, a mercenary. Morgana, a powerful sorceress. Alien creatures. The protagonist's extreme paranoia. If the origin of the overarching obstacle problem is non-sentient, a natural force, then the concise description would look something like this. An asteroid, a tsunami, cancer, dementia. So you can see once again how short and concise we are keeping it. We're not doing rich character work here. Just the basic descriptions. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my input. Step 4. Upon receiving my input, ask me to provide you with further detail regarding the nature of the external and or internal overarching obstacle that the antagonistic force introduces into the protagonist's life and world. See how it's asking me to input. Remind me only to focus on describing the overarching obstacle. At this point, we are not focusing on the impact that the obstacle may have on the protagonist's life and world. We are only focusing on identifying and describing the nature of the external and or internal obstacle that the antagonistic force introduces into the protagonist's life and world. Explain that my input can be brief or extensive, depending on how well developed my ideas about the nature of the overarching obstacle may be at this point. Notice that this prompt isn't, so give me some ideas, AI. No, it's the AI saying, hey, Dion, give me your ideas, and then I'll work with them. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my input. Step 5, upon receiving my input, provide me with the first iteration of a description of the overarching obstacle, incorporating my inputs. Make your description as concise as you possibly can, but be sure to capture the details and ideas given in my input. Follow up this first iteration by asking me to provide feedback, and with 4 or 5 questions from you that will stimulate me to provide you with more information about the exact nature of the overarching obstacle. So the questions then start sparking my imagination and eliciting further inputs from me. Make sure that your follow-up questions are narrowly focused only on the nature of the overarching obstacle and not on other things like the impact that the introduction of the overarching obstacle has on the protagonist. Nor are we interested in developing or describing the characters. We are narrowly focused on describing the nature of the overarching obstacle problem. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my input. Step 6. Upon receiving my input, provide me with a new iteration of the overarching obstacle, incorporating my feedback and any answers to the questions you posed. Keep your description as concise and clear as you can. Follow up the second iteration by asking me to provide further feedback. Then do nothing, say nothing, wait for my input. Step 7. Upon receiving my input, continue with this iterative process. Iteration, feedback, until I am satisfied with the description of the overarching obstacle. So you can see how this is placing the onus on me, the writer, to keep feeding in and being stimulated and sparked and helped with formulations by the AI. Of course, at any stage, you can say to it, give me 3 more suggestions. You can talk to it, obviously, as you can with any AI. But this prompt first starts out by making the writer work. And now I come to the definitions of an overarching obstacle. The antagonist, if sentient, or antagonistic force if a natural force, non-sentient, is the origin source of the overarching obstacle. The overarching obstacle is the primary disruption in the protagonist's life and world that drives the story. It is the obstacle that stands between where the protagonist is at the start of the story and where the protagonist desires and needs to be by its end when the overarching obstacle has been overcome, should the protagonist succeed in overcoming it. I'm up here. The overarching obstacle can be concrete, physical impediment in the protagonist's external world, and or it can be a psychological and or intellectual and or philosophical impediment in the protagonist's internal world. In some stories, the overarching obstacle is only external, physical, the battle with the other. In other stories, the overarching obstacle is only internal, within the protagonist, in which case the protagonist's own self is the antagonist, the battle with the self. In other stories, there is both an external and internal overarching obstacle, the battle with the other and the battle with the self, with the protagonist having to overcome both the external and internal obstacles, often only able to overcome the external overarching obstacle once the internal overarching obstacle has been overcome, or vice versa. The overarching obstacle gives birth to the plot. A story can be defined as the sum total of the exterior, physical, and or interior, psychological, intellectual, philosophical action taken by the protagonist to overcome the overarching obstacle. That's a story. And then examples to illustrate those principles and techniques that govern an overarching obstacle. You've seen the one from the Matrix. Here's three colors blue. A very internal, heavily character-driven drama, you'd call it an art film. The death of her husband and daughter in a car accident strips Julie's life of love, purpose, and meaning and disconnects her from society. That's her overarching. She spends the entire film trying to overcome that. Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Overarching obstacle. L. Bob Reif, who wants to control the world, has learned how to produce and is disseminating a contemporary version of a Sumerian metavirus that is transmitted biologically and physically in meat space, the real world, and via bitmap in the metaverse. Once infected with the virus, people fall under Reif's control. Hackers infected by the virus suffer severe brain damage. So all over here you are seeing examples of what is broken, what has been broken and is going to have to be fixed, as I spoke about earlier. And one last one, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce, difficult novel. Stephen Deedless was born into an environment in which family, religion, and Irish nationalism are held sacred, and any ideas of a process of self-actualization that would entail the rejection of the expectations and dictates embedded in these social forces, to follow a calling to be an artist, is frowned upon and actively discouraged. And that's Stephen Deedless's overarching obstacle, overcoming those forces and expectations. And that's the prompt. So that's the what and the how of the type of prompts I design as an Augmentor that harnesses the AI's power while ensuring that the AI thinks about storytelling in the same way that I think about it and calls for extensive inputs from me rather than the AI providing everything. Also remember that as I progress through the process of developing the nutshell outline, all the story content developed in previous phases is incorporated into the element currently being developed, because I have instructed the AI to ask for that content. In this way, the AI is using the content of all the previous elements that I've already developed to inform the story element that we are currently developing, and not go off on tangents that fall way outside the parameters of what has already been established so far. No doubt, AI platforms very soon will have developed vast contextual memory. When that finally arrives, I will cut out all the steps where I've instructed it to ask me to input previously generated content, and I'm looking forward to that day. It remembers everything of the story we have worked on so far. Righto, so let's give an AI the prompt and see what happens. I'll be working with Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which I have found to be very good at following the steps and instructions of prompts like this, and also very creative when it comes to storytelling. I used to use GPT-4, but I find Claude more suited to my work and process. You will have your favorites. Right, let's give it the prompt.